Hi, Sabine. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for talking to me about this really important issue. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Anytime. Can you tell us about yourself? So, you're a new addition to CCC. So, for anyone who doesn't know you at all yet,
Well, my name is Sabine. I am the Canadian Policy Associate at the Consumer Choice Center. I just started a few months ago, and I've been having a really good time talking about all the consumer issues that are present in Canada, and there's a lot. So I'm a busy girl. There's a lot of consumer choice issues in Canada that we have to get to. So I'm really looking forward to talking about so much more in the future. And before the CCC, I worked at a educational nonprofit, which I really enjoyed. And before that, I was a senior policy advisor to the immigration minister. So it really matters to me the topics about people moving here, people being able to pursue their dreams in Canada, um, and just being treated fairly and equitably in Canada. So this article really goes along with those lines and makes me very upset to write, but I feel very privileged to be able to actually write this article and talk about these injustices from the past. So these are things that really matter to me. So I'm really happy to talk about it today.
and thank you very much for actually diving into this topic because I know you are very passionate about immigration policies, especially within Canada. So, but today we're going to talk about from a specific angle of this. We're going to talk about the LCBO. So that
Mm-hmm.
is the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. So let's unpack this a little bit. So let's start with some foundational questions. Can you tell us about the original mission of LCBO and how it contrasts with its image today?
Sure. So the Liquor Control Board of Ontario is still alive and well. It still exists, and Ontarians probably feel like it's getting better because they can buy their beers and a lot of other things, alcohol products at Costco now, big box stores, grocery stores. But there's a lot more we can do, and the history of the LCBO isn't a good one. Far from it. The original mission of the LCBO is pretty much the same as what they portray their image as today. So they started out in 1927. Canada had prohibition before then. There were a lot of temperance groups that were up against this introduction of alcohol sales in Ontario. So to keep them happy, the government did the LCBO model, which is to control alcohol. It's in the name. So it seemed useful at the time because they're fighting against these temperance groups, but it doesn't really seem that necessary now, even though they have the same mission. So we're not in the world of like temperance movements marching down, the street in Toronto saying we want people to stop drinking. Of course, there are prohibition groups, prohibition style groups, still telling you that even one glass of beer is bad for you, with not much evidence to back that up. But it isn't like it was before, where you just they didn't want to sell any alcohol at all. And so I understand the control aspect of it, even though it's still negative then. And you'll see why it was so negative later on when we're talking about certain groups in society. But now it seems even more absurd. Like, why, as adults, do we need somebody to tell us, like the government especially, to tell us that they're just the ones who are going to sell us, like spirits, for example? I mean, the newspapers, when it first started in 1927, they're describing the scene as disgraceful. Like, oh, there's women in line and there's people like lined up out the block. So disgraceful for society. I don't think people would say that now. And yet the LCBO persists somehow. And we just don't need to force controlling adults today in today's society. If you want to have a drink with your friends, if you want to have a party, if you want to just go to the bar, like after a hard day of work, have a glass of wine. I don't really see why it has to be controlled, especially the retail aspect of it. Why can't you just buy it? Especially spirits. Even now, still you can't buy spirits anywhere other than the LCBO. So the model persists, sadly.
And I mean, I'm from Turkey. The alcohol prices and the sin taxes are pretty famous here, but not being able to buy your liquor from a corner store feels ridiculous even to me, coming from like a mostly conservative country, actually. So LCBO, when I first read about it, when I first learned about it through your piece, actually, that sounded like that can't be true, but it actually is. And this is how especially in Ontario, how it still works, and LCBO is still standing, and some people are still even supporting it for some whatever reason we don't really understand. But I really like that you put a lot of issues like racism, sexism, paternalism in LCBO. And especially, you just mentioned the early practices, how it was disgraceful that women were lining up and all of those things, like how it's bad for you, how it doesn't look good, how it's the temperament movement and everything. Can you share some examples of how these were reflected in its policies and operations also going back in the past?
Of course, and the LCBO really does have an ugly past when it comes to the treatment of people of color, women, and in particular, Indigenous peoples in Ontario. Indigenous peoples at that time were really mistreated in many ways by the government. It wasn't just in this way, but this is part of the story of the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in Ontario. When they started out, before we get into the Indigenous issues surrounding the LCBO, when they first started out in 1927, you actually couldn't work there if you were a woman or if you were a person of color. Indigenous people weren't even allowed to have a permit to buy alcohol, so you had to actually have a permit to go into the store. And then the person, before we start talking about the people who couldn't have a permit, the people who did have permits, they had to go into the store, and the store, of course, looked like a prison. So people were like, the employees were standing behind bars, for the most part, and you had to like slip your little permit in, say, and this is what I want, like a little list, and like, I want a bottle of vodka, please. And then they'd probably look you up and down. Tisk tisk. That's just my own interpretation. It's not historically accurate. Walk to the back and bring it back to you in a paper bag, like it's some illicit thing that they're giving you. And then you'd walk away, probably shamefully, into the street with your bottle of vodka. So they made it as shameful as possible for you. So if you had a permit, you had to prove how old you are, if you were morally up to the task of drinking alcohol. If the guys didn't think that you were, of course it's guys because it's only men who were able to work there, if they thought that you could drink alcohol, you were morally up to the challenge of drinking alcohol, then they would allow it. They would allow you to have a permit. They would allow you to purchase alcohol. If they look at your permit and they see you drank a little too much this month, maybe you had a party, they think that maybe you shouldn't drink, they wouldn't sell it to you. So there was that aspect of it too. But then there was the really darker, much darker aspect of it when it comes to racism. And as I said, women and people of color couldn't work there, but Indigenous people weren't even allowed to have a permit to buy alcohol at the LCBO until 1959. 1959, that is 64 years ago. That's
That
not
is
a long time ago. So
unbelievable also.
it is unbelievable, and we know people. Everybody knows somebody who was alive in 1959. It's not like it was 1859. We're like, I can't imagine this happening in my lifetime. No, this happened in people's lifetimes. So Indigenous people were just not considered, morally up to the challenge of buying alcohol, according to the LCBO. It didn't end there. The LCBO continued to view Indigenous people as a high-risk population even after 1959. So it did not end when they were able to get permits. There was harsher scrutiny for them. They were looked at it as a high-risk population. If you were half Indigenous and half white, you'd have to actually prove it to them. You had to find a way, you had to get a letter from an Indigenous leader or something saying, like, this person isn't completely Indigenous, which is so degrading and so disgusting. By the standards of the 1960s too. This isn't like just because like we just woke up recently and said this is a bad thing. If they weren't sure that you were up to the challenge of having the alcohol, they could reject your application because you sort of lived in an urban community and they didn't think that your morality was up to standard as somebody who was half white and half Indigenous. Those living in rural areas, and this wasn't like I just published an article about this in the Hamilton Spectator. One thing that wasn't in there is that they're also like people in rural areas who were Jewish, who were foreigners, who were Roman Catholics. So this is a list created by the LCBO. If they lived in rural areas, they would think that maybe you'd practice heavy drinking since you were Jewish or a Roman Catholic, or God forbid, a foreigner.
Right.
So those people were looked at as somebody who they were suspicious of. So they perhaps wouldn't give you the permit, or they'd not let you, like, it was really up to the discretion of the people that worked there. There wasn't a hard and fast rule. And these are all on documents that the LCBO sent out to retailers. This is not something that we just heard over the grapevine. Like, it's all out there. It's in these papers they would send out to everyone saying, like, if you feel like you're uncomfortable with it, just don't do it. So the issues of racism, sexism, paternalism, in the early practices of the LCBO, and I say early with a grain of salt because, as I said, this was like 60 years ago, that that it was really enforced, and not that it ended there. But the paternalism part really continues on, unfortunately. As a paternalistic organization, they still exist in that way. So it's not over.
Yeah. Oh, we also have the Modernize Ontario project, which we talk about all of these LCBO's practices, especially concerning its paternalism and what we call a neo-prohibitionist approaches in detail. We also have a video problem. I'm going to add the link to the description for this one as well. So let's talk about the Indigenous people a bit more. So, given that they now promote National Indigenous History Month, how does their past impact the credibility of their acknowledgement, especially as a paternalistic organization that's running the whole board for liquor?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something that really irritates me personally. And I find it ironic and patronizing that the LCBO celebrates National Indigenous History Month as the LCBO. I'm really happy that they're making financial contributions to organizations that need it, and I'm like, that's great. But in the website, like in the page about this, they talk about how great they are giving money away to these organizations, but they never ever acknowledge that they were part of the problem of Indigenous history, like the problems within Indigenous history. They were part of that issue, and they never mention that. They don't acknowledge that they've been part of the problem for as long as up to 1959 and beyond. And it just sounds patronizing to Indigenous people in this province, and they really don't need that. They've been patronized enough by the government of Canada, by the government of Ontario, by its crown corporations like the LCBO. It's enough. We're in 2024. We don't need to do that anymore. Like, we're past that as a society, I would hope, and yet they're still being spoken to in this way. Like, oh, here's some money for your organization. We're not even going to talk about the fact that we part of the problem. That's really upsetting.
Yeah. Accountability is actually the most important part of making peace with our past, and these organizations are just basically throwing money at that problem
Yeah.
in a way. Very sorry to hear that, but also not surprised. I'd like to ask you another question about the consumers, because actually we talk about consumers a lot more. So, looking at today's alcohol market, the LCBO's monopoly impacts consumer choice and obviously the competition.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you think this affects Ontarians and local businesses? And what could be an alternative that you can actually try that would be better for both sides or all sides in the party?
Like I said in the beginning of our conversation, we are getting more liberalization in alcohol sale in Ontario. That's a good thing. Big box stores, convenience stores are allowed to sell alcohol, but the LCBO still maintains exclusive rights over selling vodka, gin, and whiskey. In other words, no one else can sell spirits in Ontario. Furthermore, the LCBO is still the only wholesaler of alcohol in the province. So any business that needs alcohol has to buy it from the LCBO. So they can't go to, like, the Costco down the street or anything like that. They can lobby store managers, and let's talk about distributors for a second. People who make the alcohol and they want to sell it in the LCBOs, or especially the spirits now. They'll go into the store and they lobby the managers. Like, that's not the job of a store manager to get lobbied by these distributors. But the LCBO actually has a guide on its website on how to lobby them. Like, not only do they acknowledge that this is happening, but they're telling you how to do it better. It's like such a waste of time for these store managers who are trying to manage a whole store. Sometimes they're like the only alcohol store in your region, especially if you live in a rural area, and you've got this guy coming from like some brewery telling you should really tell your bosses at the LCBO to really purchase this alcohol from us because I think the people in this town would really like it. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's so inefficient. It's such a waste of money, such a waste of time. So that's what's happening. It's just like, let that sink in for a second. Um, you know, uh, So businesses have to do that. Businesses are dealing with the LCBO as a wholesaler, and also the LCBO is making decisions on what to buy. So like that's the next step. So okay, like the store manager says this will be great. See, even your cat doesn't agree with this. He's
I
like
know.
he's outraged. He's
He's very
outraged.
confused about this whole thing. Let me tell you, he's not happy.
Yeah, you tell them. You tell them. That's right. If you don't like it, don't say anything, Kitty.
Oh
So
boy.
not only not only do they actually have to do all of that. So let's say the store manager says, "Okay, I think this would be a good purchase, perhaps, because I've just gotten lobbied by this guy for 3 hours." And then the LCB goes and makes the decisions on what to buy for all of the retail places. And a lot of the times they don't consult people on the ground. And sometimes store managers are just saying, "This is the guy who." There's not a lot of way for this one person to know. And then at the larger spectrum, you're talking about a bunch of people who really aren't in touch with like what's going on in the communities. They're just corporate guys, and they're deciding what gets sold. And if it doesn't work, you're sitting on a bunch of boxes of like liquor that you can't sell, that nobody wants, and it doesn't matter because the guy on like at the top decided that's what you're going to sell. So there's very limited shelf space, and it's being taken up by things that don't sell. It's really frustrating, I think, for Ontarians to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And they're also just sitting on a bunch of alcohol you're not selling is not good. Consumers, and on top of it, like consumers just should be able to buy spirits at all these places. They have the market, like decide. Like I don't understand why you wouldn't let the market decide what to stock. This is just what happens in any retail space. To be a success, you have to know your audience. You have to know your customers, and the market says, "I like this. I don't like this." You stock it, rather than a government bureaucracy saying, "We think that you will like this. If you don't like it, well, I guess we're just stuck with the boxes." So
It's
it's really
ridiculous.
difficult.
It's this also actually just came to my mind, like where I live, the way we do it is like you have specific stores that sell specific things because they're specialized in that. So like there's a whiskey store that sells all kinds of whiskey that you wouldn't be able to find in a normal like a shop that sells alcohol, because you actually, like, I don't know, like a whiskey aficionado or something. So there is a reason why these shops are specializing on around their like very special topics, or like very special whatever, like ingredients.
Yes.
And with LCBO in Ontario, you just don't get these like very niche specific products that you tried it in Europe, you traveled once and you liked it, and it just doesn't
No.
exist because LCBO people in the LCBO never tried it, so never thought that it should be sold in Ontario. Is that right?
Right. Yes, and not just that, but I'm Lebanese. Okay, Lebanese people like their arak. It's a liquor from Lebanon. There's a lot of Lebanese people in Canada and Ontario. They like to drink their arak once in a while with their family, their friends, at their parties. There is like one or two, if we're lucky, types of arak at the LCBO for us to go buy. And they're not even that good. Like if they asked an actual Lebanese person, maybe we would tell them which alcohol we actually want, but they don't care. They're like, "Oh, this distributor is easier to deal with, or like sells it to us at like at a different price." It's not because that's the one we want. If they just ask us, we tell them this is the best one. We will buy more if you get this particular brand because we know. But when you're a convenience store owner, for example, you better know your audience. Like you better know your customers, or else you are stuck with that, and you've spent a lot of money that you probably don't even have. You're a small business owner, so they actually are much better than any LCBO bureaucrat, in my opinion, in determining what they stock. But they can't even stock liquor. So, and the spirits department, that's not even an option. Even though I would trust a convenience store owner to know much more about the market than an LCBO bureaucrat, in my opinion.
For sure, because they have to consider the consumer choices for to be able to survive, to be able to stay in business. But LCBO is going to stay in business no matter what they sell. So the
Yes,
the decision
that is the
making is
problem.
pretty problematic from the start, from the get go.
Exactly. You said it better than I could. Like, that's exactly it.
Yep. Well, the last question I have, the last official question, is the in your piece, you talk about the LCBO sense of moral superiority in regulating alcohol sales. Why do you think, we just talked about it, but why do you think this might be problematic for a government run organization? So, with this history and all the critiques that is raised, what role could Ontarians play in pushing for reforms, and what could be a fairer, more efficient alcohol distribution system looking forward?
Yeah, so, as I mean, the person that I am, I always say anytime the government tries to tell you they know better, run. You should be at least skeptical that they know what's best for you. But like, what authority do they claim to know best about what alcohol you're allowed to buy at what location? I mean, it seems pretty archaic to me. It seems like the days of yore. I think we should have moved on past this. The nanny state is alive and well, as you know. You work at the Consumer Choice Center, you're very aware of this. But in this particular instance, it really is weird. Um, like, why do we have a monopoly that claims to nanny us because they know what's best in alcohol sales? Ugh, so weird. Not only is that super creepy, but it's just inconvenient. um, much like most nanny state issues, let alone an organization that has done so much harm in the past. Like, it's important, like, Ontarians really have forgotten this, or maybe they don't even know. They never were taught, never were able to access information. It's not out there how much, it impacted Indigenous people's lives, women, people who were Roman Catholic, people who were Jewish, foreign people, newcomers to the country, exactly. Um, newcomers to Canada. It's really horrible and really inexcusable. And an organization like that telling us what we should and shouldn't do, even to this day. I mean, if you look at their website, they still say that they're responsible for they accept the responsibility of selling alcohol responsibly. So they want to be the ones who control it still. And they're proud of that. And I don't think they should be proud of that. And so speaking of pride, I am very proud that the Consumer Choice Center has taken this issue and really put out this great Modernize Ontario packet, white paper for people to look at. Because if Ontarians really want to advocate for these things, and let me tell you, first of all, that the government didn't wake up one day and say, oh, maybe we should do this alcohol thing. It was because people were advocating for it, because citizens were tired of being treated like children when it comes to alcohol. They want to buy alcohol wherever they want to buy alcohol. That's what made the government make these changes. These liberalization of alcohol came from the people. It wasn't because they've had some sort of realization come down upon them. So in order to continue that liberalization, it is in the hands of Ontarians to push for these things. And what we've done as an organization is actually allowed them to have access to ideas that we've thought about, that we've done the math on. Take a look at our ideas. I think they're really good. For example, if you go to the private retail of spirits and you stop building new LCBO or retail spots, you're saving $100 to $120 million a year in this province. If you have no new LCBOs, you could be going to $2.8 billion to $5.6 billion over the years, from 5 to 10 years. And those numbers are parsed out in that document if you want to take a look at it. And the province of Ontario in their latest budget came out and said that they are projecting a deficit of $6 billion. So I think saving in this place would be really, really nice. So the government is saying, like, we're liberalizing, and then right after they say, but don't worry, the LCBO still has exclusive rights to sell vodka, gin, whiskey. People have to start thinking, like, why? That's weird. Like, just keeping the LCBO happy and relevant. And there was a strike recently. Maybe that's part of it, just to keep them happy. And it's not our job as consumers to keep bureaucrats, LCBO bureaucrats, happy. Our job is to live the best lives that we can. And being able to have convenience and consumer choice is allowing us to live the best lives that we can. So our job as citizens is to push back on these ideas and start asking why. Why can't we have it better in Ontario? And I think that our Modernize Ontario project really allows us to look at alternatives, like viable alternatives that can be done tomorrow. We're not talking about utopic ideas here. So I really encourage people to take a look at that. There's a lot on the history of LCBO. So we really focused on making sure that we have pages of history so people can read that. And we were there's a lot of historians and Indigenous historians out there that have written about this before, and I'm really happy that we're highlighting that as an organization, the history of the LCBO, not just the political side of it, and highlighting how we can become better as a province when it comes to alcohol retail.
Thank you very much. I can see you putting your heart and soul into this project, not just because you're from Ontario and you like it, and then you like to be able to buy your own alcohol freely, but also it touches a lot of pressure points for people from Ontario. I can see that.
Definitely, I agree. I think there's such a good way forward that we could look at as a province. So why not be skeptical that the government knows best what's best for us, and then take that skepticism and actually use it to affect change, especially when it comes to an organization with such a dark past in treating others.
And
So it's
still
important.
using the citizens' hard-earned tax money and still
Yeah.
being in deficit with like 6 million billion.
Exactly. And not just that, but like the writing's on the wall. The LCBO sees the issue. Like during their strike, it was obvious to me that they saw the writing on the wall that times are changing. They wanted more investment in online sales. They wanted more investment in retail. They wanted more investment in those sections because they know what's happening. They know that the direction isn't going in their favor. Ontarians want change. Um, and just propping up that organization because it needs to be propped up is not good policy. So, good policy is looking at ourselves and seeing what we can do. And even if that means the LCBO stays as the sole wholesaler in Ontario, that's still a better solution for Ontarians than what they have now. And I will say, I will add, it's possible. This is not utopic because in Alberta, they've done it. They have a private retail system. And in British Columbia, they've done it. They have a mixed model. So they have some private and some public retail. Like it's being done in our country. This isn't something that we're looking to like Europe or the United States for. This is something that's happening now here. And in Quebec, I could go when I was like ever since I was like 19 or 20 years old, I could go over the province to Quebec and get alcohol at the convenience store. Okay, so we've been doing this for a long time. This is a Canadian thing. This isn't some weird thing that we just thought up. So it's just like let's get with the times. Let's go.
It's clearly an Ontario thing, and you've been behind. That's it.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that is all of my questions. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that people should read Modernize Ontario. I think people should check out the website, and I think people should read my article in the Hamilton Spectator because it really summarizes all these issues as well. So that is how I'd like to end the conversation because we've done a lot of great work on this, and I hope that people take the chance to look at it.
It's very easy to look at. It's very easy. The data is very available, very easy to read. I think, especially if you're from Ontario, I think there's a lot of things that you would learn from it in a very easy way. So,
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for talking to me about this.
my pleasure. It was the nicest 7 p.m. call I've ever taken. I'll
I'm so
stop
glad.
the recording.